Dear viewers, before we begin this story, I need you to sit somewhere quiet. What you're about to hear will change the way you look at churches forever. This is a true story that has never been told before. Make sure you watch until the end, because what happens next will leave you speechless. The small village of Riverside wasn't much to look at, just a cluster of houses surrounded by rolling hills and dense forests. But every Sunday morning, something remarkable happened. People would come from miles around, filling the dusty roads with their cars and feet, all heading to one place, the Divine Light Ministry, led by the famous Pastor James Anderson. To young Thomas Anderson, watching from his bedroom window each Sunday morning, it looked like a parade. Women in their brightest dresses, men in pressed suits, children scrubbed clean, and wearing their best clothes, all of them hoping to witness another miracle. Thomas would sit there counting the cars, amazed at how his father's church had grown from a small wooden building to the largest structure in Riverside. Pastor James wasn't just any preacher. People called him the miracle worker, the divine healer, the blessed one. Every service brought new stories of the impossible becoming possible. The blind would see, the lame would walk, and the poor would suddenly find wealth. But what fascinated Thomas most wasn't the miracles, it was watching his father transform. At home, Pastor James was a quiet man who spent hours in his study, often forgetting to eat unless Thomas's mother, Grace, reminded him. He wore old sweaters with holes in the elbows and could spend entire afternoons tending to his garden, talking to his plants in a gentle voice. But on Sundays, he became someone else entirely. Thomas would watch in amazement as his father put on his pristine white suit, polished his shoes until they gleamed like mirrors, and stood straighter, taller, more powerful. "Remember, son," he would say, adjusting his gold cross pin, "appearance matters. People need to see God's glory reflected in his servants." Grace, Thomas's mother, was the perfect pastor's wife. Her voice led the choir every Sunday, soaring above the others like an angel's song. She kept their home spotless, always ready for unexpected visitors seeking Pastor James's counsel. Her smile never wavered, even when exhaustion darkened the circles under her eyes. "We must always be ready to serve," she would tell Thomas, straightening his tie before services. "God's work never sleeps." From the outside, they were the perfect religious family, the ones everyone in Riverside looked up to, pointed to, and whispered about with admiration. Young mothers would tell their children, "Be like young Thomas Anderson. See how well behaved he is." Fathers would nudge their sons, saying, "That boy's going to follow in Pastor James's footsteps. Mark my words." But Thomas saw things others didn't. It started with small observations when he was 12. The strange visitors who came to their house late at night, long after his mother had gone to bed. They never used the front door, always the back, and his father would meet them in his study. Thomas would press his ear against the wall, trying to make out the whispered conversations, but all he could hear was the shuffle of feet, and sometimes, what sounded like chanting in a language he didn't understand. Then there were the strange items his father kept locked in a chest in his study. Once, when Pastor James forgot to lock it, Thomas snuck a peek inside. What he saw made his blood run cold. Bones that looked human, feathers black as midnight, bottles filled with dark liquid, and stones carved with symbols that made his eyes hurt to look at them. When his father caught him, the explanation came quickly. "These are artifacts from my missionary work in Africa, son. Educational materials to show people what false religions use, nothing more." But Thomas saw the fear in his father's eyes, the way his hands shook as he locked the chest. Animals acted strangely around Pastor James, too. The neighbors' dogs would stop barking when he walked past. Birds would fall silent in the trees. Even the stray cats that usually begged for food in their backyard would disappear when his father stepped outside. But the miracles, they were real, weren't they? Thomas had seen them with his own eyes. Like the time Mrs. Johnson, blind for 15 years, suddenly screamed during service that she could see. Or when Mr. Peterson's cancer vanished after Pastor James laid hands on him. Or the Sunday when money seemed to rain from the church ceiling, floating down like green snowflakes as the congregation sang and praised. Thomas wanted to believe. He desperately wanted to be proud of his father, to become like him someday. But there were nightmares too, nights when he would wake up to strange sounds coming from his father's study, scratching noises, whispers, and sometimes what sounded like crying. One particular Sunday stood out in Thomas's memory. It was the middle of summer, and the church was packed as usual. The air conditioning struggled to keep up with the heat of hundreds of bodies pressed together, all swaying to the music as his mother's voice led them in worship. Pastor James stood at the pulpit, resplendent in his white suit, his face shining with what looked like divine light. "Brothers and sisters," he called out, his voice rolling like thunder. "God has shown me a vision. Today, miracles will flow like water." The congregation erupted in shouts of hallelujah and praise God. Thomas sat in his usual spot in the front row, watching as his father began to walk through the crowd, touching people who fell backward, caught by waiting deacons. Then came the moment that would haunt Thomas's dreams. A young mother brought her baby forward, a tiny thing, born too early and not expected to live through the night. Pastor James took the child in his arms, raised it toward the ceiling, and began to pray. But as he prayed, Thomas saw something he couldn't explain. For just a moment, his father's shadow on the wall didn't match his shape. It was larger, distorted, with what looked like horns or branches extending from its head. And in that same moment, Thomas could have sworn he saw his father's eyes turn completely black. The baby lived, another miracle to add to Pastor James's growing legend. But that night, Thomas heard his father vomiting in the bathroom. And when he passed by his parents' room, he heard his mother asking, "How much longer, James? How much more will it take?"
"As much as necessary," his father replied, his voice hoarse. "We've come too far to stop now."
Thomas lay awake that night, staring at his ceiling, trying to make sense of what he'd seen. His father was a man of God, wasn't he? The miracles were real, people really were being healed. But why did it feel like there was something else, something darker lurking beneath the surface? In school, Thomas was known as the pastor's son, set apart from the other children. Teachers treated him differently, expecting him to be an example. His classmates either avoided him or tried too hard to be his friend, hoping some of his father's blessings would rub off on them. Only Maria, a quiet girl who sat behind him in math class, treated him normally. "My grandmother says not all that glitters is gold," she told him one day during lunch. "She says some miracles have a price." Thomas wanted to ask her what she meant, but the bell rang, and the moment passed. Yet her words stuck with him, echoing in his mind during church services as he watched his father perform miracle after miracle. As his 15th birthday approached, Thomas noticed more changes in his father. Pastor James spent more time in his study, sometimes not emerging for days. His mother would leave food outside the door, and Thomas would hear strange chanting late into the night. The miracles grew more spectacular. Now it wasn't just healing and prophecy. People claimed Pastor James could make them rich overnight, cure terminal diseases with a touch, even raise the dead. The church had to be expanded twice to hold all the people who came seeking miracles. But with each miracle, Thomas saw his father grow thinner, paler, as if something was feeding on him from the inside. The dark circles under his eyes couldn't be hidden by makeup anymore, and sometimes his hands shook so badly he had to grip the pulpit to stay upright. Yet people kept coming, desperate for miracles, willing to give anything, money, jewelry, land, even their homes, in exchange for Pastor James's prayers. The church office was filled with boxes of offerings, and their home grew more luxurious while some church members lived in poverty, having given everything they had. "It's God's will," Pastor James would say when Thomas questioned him about it. "They give in faith, and God rewards faith." But his eyes wouldn't meet Thomas's when he said it. Then came the night that would change everything. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep and heard his father's footsteps in the hallway. The night he decided to follow him into the forest. The night he discovered the terrible truth about his father's miracles. The summer night was unusually hot, even for Riverside. Thomas lay in his bed, sheets twisted around his feet, listening to the ceiling fan's rhythmic creaking. Sleep wouldn't come. His mind kept replaying the day's events. Another miraculous service where his father had supposedly raised a dead child. But Thomas couldn't forget how the grieving mother had emptied her bank account into the church's coffers before the miracle happened. The old grandfather clock downstairs struck midnight, its deep chimes echoing through the silent house. That's when Thomas heard it, the familiar sound of his father's study door opening, followed by careful footsteps in the hallway. Something felt different about tonight. Maybe it was the strange red moon hanging low in the sky, or the way all the crickets had suddenly gone silent. Whatever it was, Thomas knew he couldn't ignore it anymore. 15 years of questions demanded answers. Silently, Thomas slipped out of bed. He'd learned over the years how to move without making a sound, which floorboards creaked, which doors hinge squeaked. In the darkness, he pulled on his black hoodie and sneakers. The house felt different at night, as if it held secrets that only emerged in the darkness. From his window, Thomas watched his father's figure moving across the backyard. Pastor James wasn't wearing his usual pristine white suit. Instead, he was dressed entirely in black, carrying a large leather bag Thomas had never seen before. The moonlight cast strange shadows around him, making him appear taller, more sinister. Thomas's heart pounded as he crept downstairs and out the back door. The summer air felt thick, almost suffocating. As he followed his father's silhouette toward the forest, questions raced through his mind. Where was he going? What was in that bag? Why did he need to do this in the middle of the night? The forest at night was like entering another world. Branches reached out like gnarled fingers, and shadows seemed to move of their own accord. Thomas stayed far enough behind to remain unseen but close enough not to lose sight of his father. The path they took wasn't one he recognized, though he'd played in these woods since childhood. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, Pastor James stopped in a clearing. At its center stood the largest baobab tree Thomas had ever seen. Its massive trunk was twisted into shapes that looked almost human, its branches reaching toward the red moon, like supplicating arms. Thomas crouched behind a thick bush, his heart threatening to burst from his chest. What he saw next would haunt him forever. Pastor James set down his bag and began to prepare what looked like some kind of ritual space. He drew strange symbols in the dirt, symbols that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. From his bag, he removed items that made Thomas's blood run cold: human-looking bones, black candles, vials of dark liquid, and something that looked disturbingly like a fresh human heart. "Master," Pastor James called out, his voice different from his usual powerful Sunday sermon tone. This voice was submissive, almost pleading. "Master, I've brought what you asked for. Please, I need more power. The people expect greater miracles now." The air grew cold, unnaturally cold for a summer night. Thomas watched in horror as his breath began to mist in front of him. The red moonlight seemed to bend, creating impossible shadows around the baobab tree. Then it appeared. Thomas had to clamp his hand over his mouth to stop from screaming. Rising from the ground like smoke was a figure that defied description. It was tall, impossibly tall, with skin like black oil and eyes that burned like hot coals. When it moved, it seemed to shift between different forms, sometimes human-like, sometimes more bestial. "Ah, my faithful servant," the figure spoke, its voice like grinding stones, always so eager for more power. "But tell me, James, have you brought what I asked for?" Pastor James nodded frantically, reaching into his bag with trembling hands. He pulled out a small jar that seemed to glow from within. "Yes, Master. The tears of 100 grieving mothers, collected during their moments of deepest despair, just as you asked." The dark figure laughed, a sound that made leaves fall from the trees and small animals scurry away in terror. "Good, good, you've learned well. But you know my price keeps rising, James. The more power you want, the more you must give." Thomas watched as his father fell to his knees. "Anything, Master. I'll give anything. The church is growing, but people expect more. That woman today, with the dead child, they're filming everything now, posting it online. I need to make sure every miracle is perfect, undeniable. Anything. The figure's eyes blazed brighter. Would you give me your son? Thomas felt his heart stop. His father couldn't agree to that. But Pastor James barely hesitated. Thomas, yes, if that's what it takes. He's young, pure. Would his soul give me more power? The dark figure moved closer to Pastor James, its form rippling like heat waves. Not his soul, James. I want his future. Give me the boy's destiny, and I'll give you power that will make your previous miracles look like parlor tricks. Thomas couldn't breathe. His father, the man who had taught him to pray, who had held him during thunderstorms, who had promised to always protect him, was bargaining away his future to a demon. How? Pastor James asked, his voice eager. How do I give you his future? The figure waved its hand, and a contract appeared in the air, written in what looked like fire. Blood magic, James. Your blood, freely given, signing away your son's divine purpose. You see, your boy was meant for great things, true miracles, real healing. By signing this, you'll corrupt that destiny, twist it into something darker. His power will flow to you instead. Pastor James reached for the contract without hesitation. The figure produced a bone knife, gleaming in the red moonlight. Just a small cut, James, 1 drop of blood, freely given, and your son's destiny is mine. Thomas couldn't take it anymore. Without thinking, he stood up. Father, no. The clearing went silent. Pastor James spun around, his face a mask of shock and fear. The dark figure's blazing eyes fixed on Thomas, and its mouth stretched into an impossible grin. Ah, it purred, the boy himself. How convenient. Thomas. Pastor James's voice shook. Go home. This doesn't concern you. Doesn't concern me? Thomas felt tears streaming down his face. You're trying to sell my future to whatever this thing is. All for what? More fake miracles? More power? The dark figure laughed again, and this time the sound made Thomas's knees weak. Clever boy, you see what your father really is. Tell me, child, how long have you known about his arrangements? Thomas struggled to find his voice. I suspected something was wrong. The miracles, the money, the way animals act around him. But I never thought your own father would sacrifice your destiny for power. The figure moved closer to Thomas, its presence making the air itself feel toxic. But he has. Every miracle you've witnessed, every healing, every prophecy, all bought with pieces of his soul. And now, he's run out of soul to sell. Pastor James fell to his knees. Please, Master, don't tell him everything. He's just a boy. A boy whose future you were about to sign away, the figure reminded him. Then it turned back to Thomas. Your father has been mine for years, child. Every miracle came with a price. The blind woman who regained her sight. Your father's ability to see beauty. The lame man who walked. Your father's ability to rest. The dead child today. A year of his life. Thomas looked at his father, really looked at him, and for the first time saw the truth. Pastor James looked ancient, hollow, like a man who had been drained of everything that made him human. Why? Thomas asked, his voice breaking. Why would you do this? Power, his father whispered. They needed miracles. They would have gone elsewhere if I couldn't provide them. I couldn't let that happen. The church needed to grow. The church. Thomas felt anger rising in him. Or your pride? The dark figure clapped its hands, creating a sound like thunder. Oh, this is delicious. Such drama, such pain. But now, dear boy, you have a choice to make. A choice? Yes, the figure's eyes blazed brighter. Your father's contract with me is almost complete. He's nearly used up, but you have such potential, such pure, untapped power. You could take his place. Think of it, all that power, all those miracles, they could be yours. Thomas felt something then, a pull, a temptation. He could see it all, himself in a white suit, performing miracles, crowds chanting his name, power beyond imagination. But he also saw the truth behind it all, the cost. the corruption, the slow death of everything good and pure. "No," Thomas said, his voice stronger than he felt. "No, I won't do it. I won't make deals with darkness." The figure's eyes narrowed. "Such a shame. But perhaps watching your father's final payment will change your mind." "Final payment?" Thomas looked at his father, who had gone deathly pale. "Oh yes," the figure purred. "Did you think all this power came free, James? Tonight's the night. Your last miracle. Would you like to see it, Thomas? Would you like to see what happens when the bill comes due?" The red moon hung low over the forest clearing, casting bloody shadows through the twisted branches of the ancient baobab tree. Thomas stood frozen, watching as the dark figure loomed over his father. Pastor James knelt in the dirt, no longer the powerful preacher who commanded crowds every Sunday, but a broken man facing his final debt. "Please," Pastor James whimpered, his voice barely a whisper. "Just a little more time. I have so much more to give." The dark figure's laugh made the air itself shiver. Its eyes, burning like hot coals, fixed on Thomas as it spoke. "Watch carefully, boy. This is what happens when mortals think they can bargain with powers beyond their understanding." The figure reached out with what looked like a hand made of living shadows. As it touched Pastor James's forehead, the great preacher's back arched, and a scream tore from his throat, a sound no human should be able to make. "Father." Thomas started forward, but invisible forces held him in place. He could only watch in horror as years of dark magic began to unravel. 15 years, the figure mused, its voice like grinding stones. 15 years of borrowed power, borrowed time, borrowed life. Now it's time to collect. Pastor James's skin began to change, aging rapidly before Thomas's eyes. The proud preacher's black hair turned white, then gray, then began falling out in clumps. His smooth face wrinkled, weathered, withered like a grape left in the sun. Each miracle had a price, the dark figure explained to Thomas, almost conversationally. The blind woman who received sight? Your father gave up his ability to see beauty. Everything became gray, dull, lifeless to his eyes. Pastor James writhed on the ground as more changes took hold. His straight, strong back curved, bones cracking as they deteriorated. The lame man who walked? Your father traded his own rest. For 3 years, he hasn't had a single night of peaceful sleep. Every moment of rest filled with nightmares, every dream a torment. Thomas watched in horror as his father's hands twisted, fingers curling like dead branches. The proud preacher who had once commanded such respect now looked ancient, decrepit, barely human. The dead child from today? The figure's grin widened impossibly. That cost him 10 years of his life. But he was already living on borrowed time, wasn't he, James? I did it for them, Pastor James gasped, his voice now thin and raspy. The congregation needed miracles. They needed hope. Did they? The figure circled him slowly. Or did you need their admiration? Their worship? Their money? Memories flashed through Thomas's mind. The growing church, the expensive cars, the desperate people giving their last dollars for a chance at a miracle, all of it built on dark bargains and terrible sacrifices. But the greatest price, the figure continued, was what your deals did to your soul. Show him, James. Show your son what's left of your true self. Pastor James looked up at Thomas, and in that moment, Thomas saw something that would haunt him forever. His father's eyes were completely empty, not just the windows to his soul, but windows into a void where a soul should have been. Every miracle ate away at his humanity, the figure explained. Each healing corrupted his compassion. Every prophecy eroded his truth. The power he gained hollowed him out, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but hunger for more. Stop it, Thomas pleaded, tears streaming down his face. Please stop torturing him. The figure turned its burning gaze to Thomas. Torturing him? Oh no, dear boy, I'm simply collecting what's mine. You see, your father knew the terms. Each miracle would cost him a piece of his humanity, his life, his soul. But he kept asking for more, promising more, giving more. Pastor James tried to crawl toward Thomas, his withered hands clawing at the dirt. "Son, help me." But Thomas could see there was nothing left to help. The man before him was just a shell, emptied of everything that had made him human. The proud preacher who had commanded crowds and performed miracles was gone, leaving only a hollow husk desperate for one last taste of power. And now, the figure announced, raising its shadowy hands, "It's time for the final payment." The air in the clearing grew thick, heavy with dark energy. Thomas felt it pressing against his skin like hot oil. The red moonlight seemed to concentrate on his father, creating a crimson spotlight for what was about to happen. "Please," Pastor James begged one last time. "I'll give you anything else. Take my son's destiny, take his future, take." "Enough." The figure's roar shook the forest. "You've given everything else away, James. There's nothing left to bargain with. Now, it's time to pay your debt in full." What happened next would change Thomas forever. The figure's shadowy form expanded, filling the clearing with darkness that seemed alive. It wrapped around Pastor James like a cocoon of living night. Inside that darkness, Thomas could see his father's silhouette thrashing, struggling, as 15 years of borrowed power and stolen life were ripped away all at once. Pastor James's screams echoed through the forest, but they began to change, becoming less human with each passing second. Thomas watched in horror as his father's form within the darkness twisted, stretched, and finally shattered. When the darkness receded, there was nothing left of Pastor James but his empty clothes and the gold cross pin he always wore on his lapel. The dark figure turned to Thomas, its burning eyes now tinged with something that might have been satisfaction. "And that, dear boy, is the true price of power borrowed from darkness." Thomas fell to his knees, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. The mighty Pastor James, the miracle worker of Riverside, hadn't just died, he had been unmade. His very existence claimed as payment for years of dark bargains. "Why show me this?" Thomas asked, his voice hoarse. "Why make me watch?" The figure moved closer, its presence making the air cold enough to freeze Thomas's tears on his cheeks. "Because you have a choice to make, Thomas. Your father's congregation will need a new leader. They'll expect miracles to continue. You could take his place, continue his work. I could give you even greater power than he had." Thomas felt it then, a pull, a temptation. The figure's words painted pictures in his mind, himself performing miracles, healing the sick, commanding crowds larger than his father ever had, the power to help people, to be respected, to be worshipped. But then he remembered his father's empty eyes, the sound of his final screams, the way he had tried to bargain away his own son's future. "No," Thomas said, standing up. His voice grew stronger with each word. "I've seen the true price of your power. I choose truth, even if it's harder, even if it means no miracles at all." The figure's burning eyes narrowed. Brave words from a boy who just watched his father die. "But tell me, Thomas, how will you feel when the truth destroys everything your father built? When his congregation learns their miracles were bought with dark power? When your mother—" Thomas's heart stopped. "My mother, she doesn't know, does she?" The figure's laugh was like ice cracking. "Oh, she suspected. She saw your father changing, saw what the power was doing to him. But she chose to look away, to believe his lies. After all, the church was growing, money was flowing, and sometimes lies are more comfortable than truth." Thunder rolled overhead, though the sky had been clear moments before. The dark figure began to fade, its form becoming smoke-like. "Remember this night, Thomas," it said, its voice growing distant. "Remember the true price of false miracles, and know that my offer stands. When the weight of truth becomes too heavy, when you long for just a taste of your father's power, call my name 3 times. I'll be waiting." With that, the figure vanished, leaving Thomas alone in the clearing with his father's empty clothes and the cold light of the red moon. Dawn broke over Riverside, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. Thomas hadn't slept. How could he? His father's empty clothes lay in a heap beside him, the gold cross pin catching the first rays of morning light. He had spent hours in that clearing, unable to move, unable to think, unable to process what he had witnessed. The walk home felt like a nightmare. Each step was heavy, as if the weight of the truth was trying to drag him down. His father's car still sat in the church parking lot. What would people think when they found it there? Empty? As Thomas approached his house, he saw lights on in the kitchen. His mother was already awake, probably preparing for the early morning prayer meeting she held every Monday. The thought of facing her made his stomach turn. How could he tell her that her husband had been literally unmade by dark forces? Grace Anderson stood at the kitchen counter, humming a hymn as she prepared coffee. She turned when Thomas entered, and her smile froze on her face. Something in his expression must have given it away. "Thomas," her voice trembled slightly, "where's your father?" The question hung in the air like poison. Thomas opened his mouth, but no words came. Instead, he placed his father's clothes and the gold cross pin on the kitchen table. Grace stared at them, her face draining of color. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." She picked up the pin, her hands shaking. I told him to stop. I told him it would end this way." Thomas's head snapped up. "You knew?" Grace sank into a kitchen chair, suddenly looking years older. "I suspected. The changes in him, the strange hours, the things I'd hear from his study late at night. But I didn't want to know. We were doing God's work, weren't we? The church was growing. People were being healed. I told myself that was all that mattered." "But it wasn't God's work, was it, Mom?" Thomas's voice cracked. "The miracles, the healings, they came from something else. Something dark." His mother's silence was answer enough. She clutched the gold cross pin to her chest, tears streaming down her face. "What happened to him, Thomas? Please, I need to know." So Thomas told her everything. Following his father into the forest, witnessing the dark ritual, seeing the terrible price of 15 years of borrowed power. As he spoke, the coffee grew cold, and the sun climbed higher in the sky. The prayer meeting, Grace suddenly remembered, looking at the clock. People will be arriving at the church soon. What do we tell them? Before Thomas could answer, the phone rang. Then again, and again. News was spreading through Riverside. Pastor James's car was still in the church parking lot, but no one could find him. By noon, the police were involved. Search parties formed, combing the woods around the church. Thomas watched from his window as people gathered, their faces worried, their voices hushed. If they only knew what really lurked in those woods. "We have to tell them something," his mother said, watching the crowd grow. "But not the truth. Never the truth." "Why not?" Thomas demanded. "Don't they deserve to know what their faith and offerings really paid for?" Grace turned to him, her eyes hard. And what would that accomplish? Destroying their faith? Breaking their hope? The miracles may have come from darkness, but the healing was real. Mrs. Johnson can still see. Mr. Peterson's cancer is still gone. Would you take that from them? But even as she spoke, a commotion erupted outside. Screams came from the direction of the church. Thomas and Grace rushed out to see what was happening. Miss Johnson, the woman who had famously regained her sight during one of Pastor James's miracles, was on her knees in the church parking lot. Blood streamed from her eyes as she screamed, "It's gone. The light is gone. I can't see anymore." She wasn't alone. Throughout Riverside, others who had received miracles were finding their blessings turning to curses. Mr. Peterson collapsed, his cancer returning more aggressively than before. The lame began to fall, their healed legs failing them. Even the money that had seemingly rained from heaven during services turned to dead leaves in people's wallets. "The power that granted these miracles is gone," a familiar voice whispered in Thomas's mind. The dark figure's words carried on the wind, and with it, all its gifts. The scene at the church was chaos. People who had given everything for miracles were demanding answers. Where was Pastor James? Why were their miracles failing? What had they really paid for with their tithes and offerings? Grace tried to maintain order, telling people Pastor James had been called away on an urgent mission, that they needed to pray and keep faith. But Thomas could see the doubt in their eyes, the growing suspicion that something was terribly wrong. Then Sarah, a longtime church member, stood up in the crowd. Last night, she announced, her voice carrying over the chaos, I saw Pastor James entering the forest. He was carrying a strange bag, wearing black instead of his usual white. I followed him because I was worried. What I saw. Thomas's heart stopped. Had someone else witnessed his father's final moments? But Sarah's next words were even more chilling. I saw him meeting with others. A group of them all dressed in black. They were performing some kind of ritual. I think our pastor was involved in something evil. The crowd erupted. Some defended Pastor James, claiming Sarah was lying. Others shared their own suspicious stories, strange noises from his study, animals dying near the church, shadows moving against the light during services. If that's true, someone shouted, then our miracles were fake. We were tricked. No, another argued, my healing was real. I felt it. But look at Mrs. Johnson. Look at the others. The miracles are failing. As accusations and arguments flew, Thomas noticed something happening to the church building itself. The pristine white walls were beginning to darken, as if decades of decay were catching up in moments. The golden cross on top of the steeple turned black and twisted, like a branch burned in a forest fire. Grace saw it too. She grabbed Thomas's arm, her nails digging into his skin. We have to stop this, she whispered urgently. Your father built this ministry from nothing. We can't let it end this way. Dad built it on lies and dark power, Thomas replied. Maybe it needs to end. But even as he spoke, a new voice rose above the chaos, smooth, confident, compelling. A man in an expensive suit walked through the crowd, which parted before him like water. Brothers and sisters, he called out, his voice carrying an unnatural resonance. I am Pastor Michael, and I bring you a message of hope. Your beloved Pastor James contacted me last night. He knew he had to leave, a divine mission, you see, but he didn't want to leave you without guidance. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. This man's words were honey-coated poison, but the crowd was already falling under his spell. I've been sent to continue his work, Pastor Michael announced, to keep the miracles flowing. In fact, he pointed to Mrs. Johnson, still kneeling and bleeding. Let me show you the power I bring. He walked to Mrs. Johnson, placed his hands on her head, and spoke words that made Thomas's skin crawl, not a prayer, but something older, darker. Mrs. Johnson gasped. The blood on her face vanished, and her eyes cleared. I can see again, she cried. It's another miracle. The crowd's mood shifted instantly from anger to awe. They pressed forward, reaching for Pastor Michael, begging for their own miracles to be restored. But Thomas saw what others didn't, the same empty darkness in Pastor Michael's eyes that had consumed his father, the same hunger for power and praise, the same willingness to deal with forces beyond human understanding. Stop, Thomas shouted, pushing through the crowd. Can't you see? It's happening again. The same dark deals, the same false miracles. Pastor Michael turned to him, smiling kindly, but his eyes blazed with otherworldly fire. Ah, you must be Thomas. Your father told me so much about you. In fact, he left something specific for you. A message, a gift, an inheritance of sorts. Would you like to hear it in private? Pastor Michael's voice was honey over broken glass as he smiled at Thomas. Your father's message is for your ears alone. Shall we step into the church office? Thomas glanced at his mother, expecting to see worry on her face. Instead, Grace Anderson was staring at Pastor Michael with a look of recognition. Something passed between them, quick as a shadow, before she turned away. Go ahead, Thomas, Grace said softly. I'll handle things out here. The crowd parted as Thomas followed Pastor Michael into the church. The building felt different now, colder, as if all warmth had been sucked out of it. The walls seemed to pulse with dark energy, and the shadows in the corners moved in ways shadows shouldn't. In his father's office, no, the former pastor's office, Pastor Michael sat in the large leather chair behind the desk. He gestured for Thomas to sit, but the young man remained standing. What message could you possibly have from my father? Thomas demanded. "I watched him die last night. I saw what that thing did to him." Pastor Michael's smile widened, showing too many teeth. "Did you? Did you really see him die? Or did you see what you were meant to see?" A chill ran down Thomas's spine. "What do you mean?" "Your father was clever, Thomas. Very, very clever. He knew his debt was coming due, knew what the Dark One would claim, so he made arrangements." Pastor Michael reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a familiar object, his father's journal. Thomas had seen him writing in it countless times, but had never been allowed to read it. The leather-bound book seemed to radiate a subtle darkness. "Your father's last confession," Pastor Michael said, placing the journal on the desk. "The truth about everything, the miracles, the powers, the price. But more importantly, the truth about you, Thomas. About who and what you really are." Thomas stared at the journal, his heart pounding. "What do you mean, what I really am?" "Open it," Pastor Michael urged. "See for yourself." With trembling hands, Thomas picked up the journal. The moment his fingers touched the leather, a jolt of energy shot through him. The pages fell open to an entry dated 15 years ago, the day Thomas was born. "My son is not my son," the first line read in his father's familiar handwriting. "The child Grace holds is not of my blood, not of her blood, not of any human blood. He is our miracle, our salvation, and our damnation." Thomas felt the room spin as he read on. The truth spilled out in his father's frantic writing. "Grace and I had tried for years to have a child. Nothing worked. We were desperate. Then she met the wise woman in the woods, the one they called Mother Midnight. She promised us a child, but not one born of flesh. A child of power, of ancient blood, of the old forces that still lurk in the dark places of the world. We performed the ritual on a night like this, under a red moon. Grace drank the mixture Mother Midnight prepared, blood and herbs and things I dare not name. 9 months later, Thomas was born. But what we created, what we invited into our lives." "No," Thomas whispered, looking up at Pastor Michael. "This can't be true. I'm their son. I'm human." "Are you?" Pastor Michael stood, his form suddenly seeming larger, more imposing. "Haven't you always felt different? Haven't you always sensed things others couldn't? Haven't you wondered why your father was so desperate to trade away your destiny?" Memories flooded Thomas's mind, animals falling silent around him, not just his father. The way he could sense people's pain before they spoke it. The strange dreams that always came true. "Your father didn't make deals with dark powers for miracles," Pastor Michael continued. "He made deals to contain your power, to keep you from realizing what you truly are. Every miracle he performed was just a fraction of the power you naturally possess." But the dark figure," Thomas stammered. Pastor Michael laughed, a sound that made the shadows dance. "A performance. A show to make you fear power, to make you reject your true nature. Your father's last attempt to keep you bound, weak human. My mother, she knows. Grace knows everything. She's the one who chose this path. Mother Midnight was her teacher long before she became your father's wife. The perfect churchwoman, the devoted wife, all a mask to hide the most powerful witch in 3 generations." As if summoned by his words, Grace appeared in the doorway. Gone was the humble pastor's wife. She stood taller, stronger, her eyes blazing with an inner fire Thomas had never seen before. "It's time you knew the truth, my son," she said, her voice carrying power that made the air vibrate. "Everything your father did was to suppress your nature, to keep you from becoming what you were always meant to be." "And what exactly am I meant to be?" Thomas asked, his voice shaking. Pastor Michael's form began to shift, his expensive suit melting away to reveal robes as dark as the space between stars. His face changed too, becoming both ancient and ageless. "You, dear Thomas, are a child of the old powers, not demon, not angel, but something far older. Something that existed before churches, before prayers, before the very concept of good and evil. Your father feared this truth. He made deals with lesser powers to bind you, to keep you small." Grace moved to stand beside Pastor Michael. "No, whatever he really was, your father thought he was protecting you, protecting everyone. He didn't understand that suppressing your nature would only make it more dangerous when it finally broke free. The dark figure in the woods, Thomas realized, it didn't take him at all, did it? Your father ran, Grace confirmed. When he realized he could no longer contain your power, no longer maintain the bindings, he fled. The empty clothes, the dramatic disappearance, all staged to make you fear power, to make you choose weakness. Pastor Michael, or whatever he was, held out his hand. The choice before you now is simple, Thomas. Continue living the lie your father created, bound and blind to your true nature. Or embrace what you really are, unlock the power that is your birthright. And what happens if I embrace it? Thomas asked. What happens to all those people out there? They are sheep, Grace said dismissively. They traded their dignity for false miracles, their wisdom for comfortable lies. Perhaps it's time they learned the true meaning of power. But as Thomas looked at his mother, really looked at her, he saw something in her eyes that didn't match her words, fear. Not of him, but for him. That's when the final piece clicked into place. You're lying, Thomas said, straightening his spine. This is just another test, isn't it? Another attempt to corrupt me? Pastor Michael's form flickered, like a candle in wind. What makes you so sure? Because my mother would never call people sheep. Because the real Grace Anderson believes in compassion, in helping others. And because, Thomas pulled his father's journal close, this isn't my father's handwriting. It's good, very close, but the ya's are wrong. He always looped them differently. The office grew darker, colder. Pastor Michael's form began to twist, becoming something much more horrific. Clever boy, it hissed. So very clever. But if we're not telling the truth, where is your real mother? Thomas's blood ran cold as he spun around. The figure wearing his mother's face smiled, a terrible, inhuman smile. What have you done with her? Thomas demanded. The thing wearing his mother's face smiled at Thomas, teeth too sharp, eyes too sharp. The office had grown colder, shadows writhing along the walls like living things. Pastor Michael, or whatever it really was, had transformed into a towering figure of darkness and malice. Where is my real mother? Thomas demanded again, his voice stronger than he felt. Closer than you think, the creature wearing Grace's face said, and farther than you could ever reach. Suddenly, a sound cut through the darkness, a woman's scream, echoing from somewhere beneath the church. Thomas's heart stopped. He knew that voice. Mom? The basement, the dark figure that had been Pastor Michael, purred. Your father kept more secrets than you knew, Thomas. So many rooms beneath this holy place. So many hidden spaces where truth gets buried. Thomas ran out of the office, down the hall, toward the basement door. The creatures didn't try to stop him. Their laughter followed him down the stairs, echoing off the walls in ways that defied physics. The church basement looked normal at first. Folding chairs stacked against walls, old hymn books in boxes, the musty smell of aged paper, and forgotten prayers. But as Thomas moved deeper, he saw something that had never been there before. A door half hidden behind a storage shelf, marked with symbols that seemed to shift and change as he looked at them. The scream came again, closer now. Thomas grabbed the door handle, ignoring the electric shock that ran through his arm. It opened to reveal a narrow staircase, descending into darkness. Mom, he called out, starting down the steps. I'm coming. The stairs seemed to go down forever, much deeper than should have been possible. The air grew thicker, heavier, filled with the smell of old incense and something metallic, blood. Finally, the stairs ended in a circular chamber that stopped Thomas in his tracks. The walls were covered in hundreds of photographs, faces of people he recognized from church, but not their smiling Sunday faces. These showed them in moments of despair, pain, and grief. His father had photographed them at their lowest points, capturing their suffering. Your father was quite the collector, a voice said from behind him. Thomas spun to find the false Grace standing there, though he hadn't heard her follow him. He understood that true power comes from pain. Every tear, every cry of anguish, he captured them all, fed them to the darkness, grew stronger with each one. Where is my mother? Thomas asked through gritted teeth. The creature pointed to the center of the room. There, in a circle of black candles, sat Grace Anderson. She was tied to a chair, but her eyes were clear and alert. When she saw Thomas, she didn't look frightened. She looked determined. "Thomas," she said calmly, too calmly for someone bound in a ritual circle, "remember what I taught you about gardens?" The random question caught him off guard. "What?" "About how sometimes, to protect the flowers, you have to let weeds grow. How do you have to wait for just the right moment to pull them?" The false Grace laughed. How touching, mother and son sharing gardening tips at a time like this. But we're done waiting. Her form began to shift, skin peeling away to reveal something ancient and terrible beneath. It's time for Thomas to learn his true heritage. You see, Thomas, the thing that had been, Pastor Michael said, materializing from the shadows, your father didn't make deals with us for power. He made deals to hide you from what you really are. But now it's time for you to wake up. The creatures began to chant in that ancient language Thomas had heard in the woods. The candles' flames turned black, and the photographs on the walls began to weep real tears. But Grace Anderson smiled. "Now, Thomas," she shouted, "remember the weeds." In that moment, understanding flashed through Thomas's mind. All those Sunday mornings in the garden with his mother, she hadn't just been teaching him about plants. She had been teaching him something else, something hidden in plain sight. Thomas closed his eyes and began to recite what he had thought was just a gardening rhyme: roots of darkness, stems of light, flowers blooming in the night. The creatures howled, "Stop him!" But Grace joined in, her voice harmonizing with her son's. What grows below and what grows above, bound by blood and bound by love. The photographs on the walls burst into flame. The black candles exploded. And Thomas felt something wake up inside him, not darkness, not light, but something in between, something powerful. His mother had never been the helpless pastor's wife. She had been preparing him for this moment all along. "Your father tried to protect you with darkness," Grace said, her ropes falling away as she stood. "I knew a better way. I taught you to tend your power like a garden, to let it grow naturally, to understand both shadow and light." The creatures tried to attack, but they couldn't cross the circle of melted wax that had once held Grace. Thomas could see their true forms now, ancient things, neither demon nor angel, but hungry echoes of powers that had existed before either. "Your father discovered what you were when you were born," Grace continued. "A child of twilight, rare souls born with the ability to walk between light and darkness, to understand both, to master both. He panicked, made deals with these things to bind your power. But I knew you needed to find your own way. All those garden lessons," Thomas realized, "the prayers you taught me, were really spells," Grace nodded, "hidden in plain sight, teaching you to control your gift without binding it. Your father meant well, but he never understood. True power isn't about choosing light over darkness or darkness over light. It's about finding the balance between them." The false Grace screamed in rage. "You think these parlor tricks can stop us? We've eaten better witches than you." "But you've never faced a child of twilight before, have you?" Grace asked calmly. "Someone who understands that every shadow needs light to exist, and every light casts shadows." Thomas felt the power flowing through him now, natural as breathing. Not good, not evil, but something else entirely. His mother hadn't been teaching him to garden, she had been teaching him to tend his own power, to understand its natural cycles, its need for both sun and shadow. "Your father's still alive," Grace revealed. "These creatures kept him prisoner in another realm, using his guilt and fear to feed their power. That's what they wanted to do to you, trap you between worlds, feed on your power forever." Enough. The thing that had been Pastor Michael roared. Its form expanded, filling the chamber with living darkness. "If we can't have his power, we'll devour both your souls." The chamber beneath Divine Light Ministry had become a battlefield of shadow and light. Thomas stood beside his mother, Grace, feeling power surge through him like electricity. The creatures that had impersonated Pastor Michael and his mother writhed and transformed. their true forms too terrible for human minds to comprehend. Thomas, Grace spoke quickly, her voice steady despite the chaos. Your father is trapped in what these beings call the Twilight Realm. It's a space between spaces, where they keep their most valuable prisoners. How do we reach him? Thomas asked, watching as the shadows around them grew teeth and claws. The same way your father accessed their power for his miracles, through the veil. But this time, we're not making deals, we're breaking them. The false Pastor Michael's laugh shook the chamber walls. You think you can breach our realm? Even if you reach James, he's no longer the man you knew. 15 years of feeding on his guilt, his fear, his regret. He's our creature now. But Grace smiled, a confident, knowing smile that made the creatures hesitate. You never understood what really powered James's miracles, did you? You thought it was your dark energy, but it was his love. His desperate love for his son, his willingness to sacrifice everything to protect him. That's a power you can't corrupt. She turned to Thomas. The photos on these walls, they're not just records of suffering. They're anchors, connecting this place to the Twilight Realm. Your father wasn't collecting pain. He was leaving a trail of breadcrumbs, hoping someday someone would understand. Thomas looked at the photographs with new eyes. In each one, hidden in the background, he could see a symbol, subtle, easily missed, but forming a pattern when viewed together. A map, he whispered. He created a map to the Twilight Realm. The creature wearing his mother's face lunged, but Thomas was ready. The power his mother had taught him to nurture flowed naturally now. Light and shadow merged at his command, creating barriers the ancient beings couldn't cross. Quickly, Grace urged, pulling out a piece of chalk. Help me complete the circle. Your father taught you sacred geometry in all those after-school math lessons, remember? This is what he was really preparing you for. As Thomas and Grace worked, drawing complex patterns on the chamber floor, the creatures grew more frantic. They hurled shadows like spears, screamed in languages that made the air itself bleed. But they couldn't break through the barrier Thomas maintained. You'll never reach him in time, the false Pastor Michael snarled. Even now he's fading. Soon there won't be anything left to save. But Thomas remembered something, a Bible verse his father had made him memorize years ago. Not scripture at all, he now realized, but an instruction between the shadow and the light, between the day and darkest night. Speak the words that bridge the way, where twilight children learn to play. As Thomas recited these words, the chalk patterns began to glow. The photographs on the walls vibrated, their images shifting to reveal doorways, hundreds of potential passages to the Twilight Realm. Only one is real, Grace said urgently. The others are traps. Think, Thomas, what was special about your father's study? What did he want you to remember? Thomas closed his eyes, thinking back to all those times he'd watched his father write in his journal, the way he always sat in his chair at precisely the same angle, how he positioned his desk lamp to cast very specific shadows. Thomas pointed to a photograph in the far corner. Unlike the others showing church members in pain, this one showed Pastor James himself, sitting in his study. The shadow cast by his desk lamp formed a perfect cross on the wall, but with an extra line, turning it into a key. That's it, Grace exclaimed. Your father's greatest deception wasn't just hiding your nature, Thomas. It was hiding his own understanding of these forces. He wasn't just making deals with darkness, he was studying it, mapping it, learning its weaknesses. They moved to stand before the photograph. Grace took Thomas's hand, her grip strong and sure. Are you ready? Once we cross over, we'll be in their realm. All the rules we know, all the boundaries between what's possible and impossible, they don't exist there. Thomas nodded, feeling both terrified and strangely calm. How will we find him? Follow the light that looks wrong, Grace said. Your father always kept a small piece of true divine light with him, that gold cross pin he always wore. In a realm of twisted shadows, it'll shine like a beacon. The creatures made one final assault, their forms merging into a wave of living darkness that threatened to drown the chamber in chaos. But Thomas raised his hands, combining his mother's teachings of balance with his father's hidden knowledge of sacred geometry. The waves split around them, unable to touch what it couldn't understand. "Now," Grace commanded. Together, they stepped through the photograph. The world turned inside out. They emerged into a place that defied description. The Twilight Realm was like looking at reality through a cracked mirror while underwater. Gravity seemed optional, colors had sounds, and sounds left visible trails in the air. Above them, or maybe below, direction had no meaning here. Twisted spires of shadow rose like the ribs of some cosmic beast. And somewhere in this impossible space, Pastor James waited. "Listen," Grace whispered, though her voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Do you hear it?" At first, Thomas heard nothing but the strange ambient sounds of the realm, colors shifting, reality bending, the whispers of creatures that lived in the spaces between spaces. But then, a hymn, faint, clear, sung in his father's voice. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. The voice was weak, damaged by 15 years of captivity, but there was something pure about it that even this twisted realm couldn't corrupt. Thomas felt tears on his cheeks, though they floated away like tiny crystals as soon as they fell. "We have to hurry," Grace urged. "The longer we stay here, the more this place will try to change us. Look for the cross pin's light. Your father would have kept it close, no matter what they did to him." They moved through the impossible landscape, passing things Thomas's mind refused to process. He saw memories given physical form, prayers twisted into chains, and faith crystallized into weapons. The creatures of this realm flitted around them, ancient, hungry things that had never fully understood the power of human love. Then they saw it, a gleam of true light in the shifting darkness. And there, suspended in a cage of shadows, was Pastor James Anderson. The cage of shadows hung in the impossible space of the Twilight Realm, and within it, Pastor James Anderson was both there and not there. His physical form flickered like a bad television signal, sometimes solid, sometimes transparent. But most disturbing was how he kept shifting between different versions of himself. One moment, he was the proud preacher in his white suit, commanding crowds with raised hands. The next, he was a broken man in torn clothes, weeping in darkness. Then he would become something else entirely, a figure of pure shadow with eyes that had seen too much. "Dad?" Thomas called out, his voice creating ripples in the color-filled air. All versions of Pastor James turned to look at him. "No," they spoke in unison, "you shouldn't be here. Run, Thomas, run before they." Too late, a chorus of voices echoed through the realm. The creatures that had posed as Pastor Michael and Grace emerged from the twisting landscape. But here in their true domain, they were impossibly larger, more terrible. Their forms hurt to look at, as if they were made of angles that shouldn't exist. The prodigal family they mocked, finally reunited. How perfect. Now we can complete what began 15 years ago. Grace stepped forward, her power flowing around her like a storm. "You've held my husband long enough. We've come to take him home." The creatures laughed, a sound that made reality crack around them. "Home? Look at him. He hasn't been home in 15 years. Every miracle he performed took a piece of his humanity. Every healing drained his soul. He's more shadow than substance now." Thomas looked closely at his father and saw the terrible truth. The cage wasn't just holding Pastor James, it was part of him. The shadows had grown into him, through him, becoming as much a part of him as his own flesh. "The boy understands," the creatures purred. "See how the darkness has married your father's soul? To free him would be to unmake him. Unless..." "Unless what?" Thomas demanded. "Unless someone takes his place. A soul freely given, a perfect exchange. That's the law of this realm. Nothing can be taken that isn't freely given. Nothing can be freed unless another is bound." Grace grabbed Thomas's arm. "No, we'll find another way." But Pastor James's voice cut through the chaos, clear and strong for the first time. "There is no other way. I learned that too late. This realm operates on perfect balance. Every light needs a shadow. Every freedom demands a prison." The creatures swirled around them, their voices filled with dark joy. But it can't be just any exchange. It must be blood for blood, power for power. Only one of you carries enough light and shadow to replace him. Thomas understood. A child of twilight, someone who could walk between light and darkness. Him. "I'll do it," he said quietly. "No," both his parents shouted. But Thomas turned to his mother, seeing the tears in her eyes. "You taught me about balance, about tending both light and shadow. This is what that means, isn't it? Making the hard choices, understanding that sometimes the price of light is darkness." "Listen to your son," the creatures whispered. "He understands better than his father ever did. James tried to cheat us, to bargain for power without truly understanding the cost. But this one sees clearly." Grace's voice shook. "Thomas, you don't know what you're offering. This realm, it will consume you, change you. The son I raised will cease to exist." "No," Thomas said with sudden certainty. "That's what you never understood about me, what Dad never understood. I'm not just light or shadow, I'm both. Always have been. That's why Dad's deals to suppress my nature never truly worked." He turned to the creatures. "But I have conditions." The ancient beings grew still, curious. "Speak." "First, my father goes free, completely free. No lingering bonds, no hidden claims. Second, you leave Divine Light Ministry alone. Find your power somewhere else." The creatures considered. "And in exchange?" "I'll stay, not as your prisoner, but as your moderator, someone who understands both sides. Someone who can help maintain the balance between your realm and ours." The shadows stirred with interest. "You would willingly become a bridge between worlds?" "Yes, because that's what I am, what I've always been. Dad tried to force me to be all light. You wanted to corrupt me into all shadow. But my true purpose is to be neither and both." Grace stepped forward. "Then I'm staying too." "Mom, no. Listen to me, Thomas. You're right about being a bridge, about maintaining balance. But every bridge needs anchors on both sides. Your father will be the anchor in the human world, ensuring the church never again makes deals with darkness. I'll be your anchor here, helping you navigate this realm." The creatures hissed. 2 for 1, the balance. "Will be perfect," Grace interrupted. "A family divided between realms, maintaining the true balance. Isn't that a more powerful arrangement than simply caging one soul?" Thomas felt something shift in the realm, a recognition, an acceptance. The creatures swirled around them, their forms becoming less harsh, more contemplative. "We accept," they said finally. The father returns to shepherd the light, while mother and son tend the twilight. A perfect triangle of power. The cage of shadows around Pastor James began to dissolve. He fell forward, and Thomas caught him, solid now, real, though changed by his years in darkness. His white suit was gone, replaced by simple clothes, and his hair had gone completely white. But his eyes, when they met his son's, were clear and aware. "I'm so sorry," Pastor James whispered. "I thought I was protecting you, but I was only protecting my own fear. You were never something to be fixed or contained. You were a gift I was too blind to understand." Thomas hugged his father, feeling the years of separation, fear, and misunderstanding dissolve between them. "Go home, Dad. Make the church what it should have been all along, a place of true faith, not false miracles." "But you, both of you," Pastor James looked at his wife and son with tears in his eyes. Grace took his hand. "We'll see each other again. The veil between worlds thins in twilight. Visit the church garden at dusk, when shadow and light balance perfectly. We'll be there, watching over the border between worlds." The creatures began to move, reality bending around them. It's time. The exchange must be completed. Thomas and Grace stood together, ready to embrace their new role as guardians of the twilight. Pastor James straightened, finding strength he had thought lost forever. 1 month had passed since that night in the Twilight Realm. Divine Light Ministry stood transformed, both physically and spiritually. The once white walls now shimmered with subtle patterns that changed as day turned to dusk and dusk to dawn. The golden cross atop the steeple had been replaced with a simple crystal that caught both light and shadow, scattering them in perfect balance. Pastor James Anderson was a changed man. Gone were the pristine white suits and booming proclamations of miracle healings. Instead, he wore simple black clothes with a silver trim and spoke to his congregation about deeper truths, about balance, about the price of true faith, about the difference between quick fixes and real healing. Many of the old congregation had left when the flashy miracles stopped. But new people came, drawn by something they couldn't quite explain. They spoke of feeling both light and shadow in the church, not as opposing forces, but as complementary powers working in harmony. The garden, once just a show of Pastor James's supposed humility, had become the heart of the new ministry. Each evening at twilight, people gathered there to witness something extraordinary. As the sun set and shadows lengthened, those with eyes to see could catch glimpses of Grace and Thomas moving between the plants. Not their physical forms, but their twilight selves, mother and son tending to the borders between worlds, ensuring neither light nor shadow grew too strong. The garden teaches us everything we need to know, Pastor James would tell visitors, walking among the paths his wife had laid out years ago. Some plants need full sun, others thrive in shade, but most require both. Just like souls, we all need both light and shadow to grow properly. But not everything was peaceful. Other churches in the area, especially those led by pastors dealing in dark powers, saw Divine Light Ministry as a threat. They spread rumors claiming Pastor James had gone mad with grief after losing his wife and son in a tragic accident. They couldn't allow the truth to spread, that real power came not from deals with darkness, but from understanding the balance between light and shadow. Pastor Jerry from the rival church, who had once stolen Pastor James's congregation with false miracles, was particularly troubled. His own powers had begun to wane, his dark benefactors demanding ever higher prices for their favors. One Sunday morning, Pastor Jerry stormed into Divine Light Ministry during service, his face twisted with rage and fear. "Lies," he screamed, pointing at Pastor James. "All lies. You claim to walk in truth, but I know what really happened to your wife and son. Tell them how you sacrificed them for power." The congregation stirred uneasily, but Pastor James remained calm. He looked at Pastor Jerry with eyes that had seen both the deepest darkness and the brightest light, and found peace with both. "Would you like to see my family, Jerry?" he asked quietly. Pastor Jerry faltered. "What?" "It's almost twilight. Come to the garden." The entire congregation followed as Pastor James led them outside. The sun was setting, painting the sky in colors that seemed more vivid than usual. The garden shadows danced with a life of their own. As darkness and light balanced perfectly, the air between the plants began to shimmer, and there, as clear as day, but somehow also ethereal as mist, stood Grace and Thomas. They didn't look like prisoners or victims. They were magnificent, transformed but not corrupted, powerful but not corrupted. Grace's hand shaped reality itself as she tended to cosmic forces like they were delicate flowers. Thomas walked between light and shadow as easily as stepping between garden rows. Pastor Jerry fell to his knees. "How? What are they?" "They are what they chose to be," Pastor James replied. "Not trapped in light or lost to darkness, but walking the twilight path, the true path, the balanced way." Grace's voice echoed through the garden, though her lips didn't move. "Show him, Thomas. Show him what real power looks like." Thomas turned his twilight gaze to Pastor Jerry, and in that moment, everyone present could see the dark chains binding the false prophet, contracts and deals he'd made, each one eating away at his soul. "You don't have to live in chains," Thomas said, his voice carrying the weight of both worlds. "The beings you deal with don't own you. There's always a choice." "Help me," Pastor Jerry whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Please help me break free." The night Pastor Jerry sought redemption at Divine Light Ministry, something shifted in the spiritual realm. Like a stone thrown into still water, his cry for help sent ripples through both worlds. Other pastors who had made similar dark bargains felt it, and so did the ancient beings they had dealt with. They came at midnight, shadows deeper than darkness itself, moving across Riverside like a storm. Hundreds of corrupt pastors followed in their wake, pulled by invisible chains, their churches emptying as congregations sensed something wrong in the air. Pastor James stood in the Divine Light Ministry garden, watching the darkness approach. He wore no fancy suit now, no golden cross. Instead, a simple silver chain held Thomas's childhood crystal, the one his son had always claimed could catch rainbows in the dark. "They're coming," he said quietly to the twilight air. "All of them." The space between worlds shimmered, and Grace appeared beside him, more presence than form. "The Ancient Ones are afraid," she said. "They've never faced anything like this. A family spanning 3 realms, working in perfect balance." Thomas materialized on his father's other side, his twilight form casting both light and shadow. "They should be afraid. We're not just fighting their power anymore, we're offering something better." The dark storm reached the church grounds. At its head stood a figure that had once called itself Pastor Michael, now revealed in all its terrible glory. Behind it, trapped in nets of shadow, were hundreds of preachers who had traded true faith for false power. "This ends tonight," the dark being's voice shook the earth. "You've disrupted the natural order. These souls are ours by right, freely given, fairly claimed." Pastor James stepped forward. "You call it natural order, but there's nothing natural about trading pieces of your soul for power. You've twisted faith into a marketplace." "And what do you offer instead?" the being mocked. "Balance? Understanding? Growth? Humans don't want those things. They want instant miracles, quick fixes, easy answers." "Do we?" Pastor Jerry's voice rang out as he pushed through the crowd of enslaved preachers. "Or is that just what you convinced us to want?" The dark being's form rippled with anger. "You dare question? After all the power we gave you?" "Power that came with chains," Jerry replied. "But now I see there's another way." He turned to the other preachers. "Look at them. Look at what real faith can be." He pointed to the Anderson family, Pastor James standing firmly in the human world, Grace glowing with twilight wisdom, and Thomas moving between realms as naturally as breathing. They weren't just 3 individuals anymore. They were a living triangle of power, each supporting the others in perfect balance. "Enough," the dark being roared. "If you won't honor your contracts, we'll claim you all." The shadow storm surged forward, but it hit something unexpected, a barrier of neither light nor shadow, but something in between. Thomas raised his hands, channeling power from both realms. "Mom," he called out, "the garden lessons." Grace understood immediately. Her voice rang with ancient knowledge as she began to sing, not a hymn, but the gardening song she had taught Thomas years ago. Pastor James joined in, adding the prayers he had hidden in mathematics lessons. Their voices created something new, a harmony that existed between worlds. The shadow nets began to dissolve. One by one, the enslaved preachers felt their dark chains breaking. But freedom brought a choice. "Choose now," Thomas called out to them, "not light or darkness, but balance, not power over others, but understanding of yourself." Pastor Jerry was the first to step forward, then another preacher and another. They moved into the garden where light and shadow danced together, where Grace's careful planting had created a physical manifestation of spiritual balance. The dark beings shrieked in rage, their forms beginning to dissolve. Without human faith and fear to feed them, they were losing their hold on the physical world. "You cannot end us," they howled. "We are eternal. We are necessary." "No," Thomas replied calmly. "What's necessary is balance. You forgot that. You can exist in your realm, but not here. Not anymore." Grace raised her hands, opening a path to the twilight realm, not as a prison this time, but as a natural part of existence, one piece of a greater whole. "Go home," she commanded. "Your time of making deals is over." With a sound like 1,000 screams fading into whispers, the dark beings were pulled back into their own realm. But this time the door didn't close completely. Instead, it became like the crystal atop the church, a transparent barrier that let light and shadow flow naturally, without forced bargains or desperate deals. As dawn broke over Riverside, hundreds of pastors stood in the Divine Light Ministry garden, freed from their dark chains but faced with a new challenge, learning to rebuild their faith on foundations of truth rather than power. Pastor James addressed them all. The road ahead won't be easy. Some of your congregations will leave when the quick miracles stop, but others will come, drawn by something deeper than spectacle. We'll help you rebuild, teach you what we've learned about balance. And the dark beings, someone asked, will they try to return? Thomas smiled, his form shifting between worlds. They can't offer what nobody wants to buy. Real faith was never about instant miracles or borrowed power. It's about growth, understanding and accepting both light and shadow as natural parts of existence. Grace moved through the garden, her twilight form touching each plant. Where she passed, flowers bloomed that seemed to glow from within, not with pure light or pure darkness, but with something in between. This garden will be your school, she said. Come at twilight, learn the lessons I taught Thomas. Understand that every soul, like every plant, needs both sun and shadow to grow properly. And so Divine Light Ministry became something new, not just a church, but a center of balance. The crystal atop the steeple caught both light and shadow, scattering them in patterns that reminded everyone of eternal truths. That real miracles don't come from desperate deals, but from understanding and growth. That true power isn't found in light or darkness alone, but in the wisdom to walk between them. That faith, like a garden, needs tending with patience, love, and acceptance of natural cycles. The Anderson family had found their destiny, not as victims of dark power, but as teachers of a better way. Pastor James guided those seeking truth in the physical world. Grace tended the boundaries between realms. And Thomas walked between worlds, helping others understand that they didn't have to choose between light and darkness. They just had to learn to balance both. Dear viewers, as we end this story, look around your own world. How many churches do you know that promise instant miracles? How many leaders claim divine power while hiding dark deals? Perhaps it's time for a change. Perhaps it's time to understand that true faith, like the most beautiful garden, grows in both light and shadow. If this story has touched you, share it with others who might need to hear its message. Subscribe to our channel for more tales that will make you question everything you thought you knew about faith, power, and the eternal dance between light and shadow. Remember, the next time someone offers you a miracle that seems too good to be true, think of the Anderson family and their garden. Ask yourself, am I seeking quick power or true growth? Am I running from darkness or learning to understand it? Am I choosing a side or finding my own balance? Thank you for joining us on this journey. Stay blessed, stay aware, and never stop questioning the price of miracles. Because sometimes, the greatest power isn't in making darkness disappear, but in learning to walk confidently through twilight. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. How has this story changed your view of faith and power? What churches in your area might be dealing with forces they don't understand? Share your experiences, but more importantly, share this wisdom. True miracles don't need dark deals. They just need the patience to let both light and shadow do their natural work. Until our next story, dear viewers, may you find your own path through the twilight.